By the summer of 1924, the red brick house called Chartwell, on the hill above Westerham in Kent, stood newly remade, its Tudor core wrapped in Philip Tilden's stepped-gabled extensions facing the Weald. In an upstairs room overlooking the terraced lawn, joinery was finished on a peculiar floor, wide planks laid like the timbers of a ship's quarterdeck, the surface on which Winston Churchill intended to pace, dictate, and revise his own past. The sale particulars that had once advertised an imposing mansion in need of repair lay filed away. Now, polished oak beams framed a study that Churchill would call his workshop for over 40 years and the heart of Chartwell. On the desk, proofs and ministerial minutes began to pile higher than the inkwell. Outside, the view he famously said he had bought Chartwell for stretched unaltered towards the horizon. The house looked permanent. The study's real work would be to ensure that his failures did not. In July 1921, Winston Churchill stood in the damp downstairs hall of Chartwell Manor, water stains mapping the plaster above his head, floorboards soft beneath the Turkish carpet that failed to hide their rot. The house, empty for years, smelled of mildew and mouse droppings. Outside, through windows thick with grime, the land fell away southward in folds of woodland and pasture toward the Sussex border, ridge after ridge dissolving into blue distance. He had come to view a wreck advertised in the estate pages of the Times as an imposing mansion requiring modernization. He left, having decided to buy a view. The particulars, preserved now in the Churchill archives at Cambridge, described the property with the careful euphemism of auctioneers handling distressed goods. Chartwell Manor, near Westerham, Kent, a substantial country residence of considerable charm, comprising hall, 3 reception rooms, 9 principal bedrooms, domestic offices, stabling, approximately 80 acres of pasture and woodland, commanding exceptional southerly aspect over the Weald. What the particulars did not mention was that the Victorian fabric, added to an older Tudor farmhouse in the 1870s, had been slowly collapsing for a decade. The drains were inadequate, the roof leaked, dry rot had colonized the joists beneath the billiard room. The gardens, once tended by a staff of 6, had reverted to bramble and self-seeded ash saplings. Churchill bought it anyway, in September 1922 for £5,000, without first securing Clementine's agreement. She learned of the purchase by letter while visiting relatives. "I do hope you will not be too angry," he wrote, with the sheepish optimism of a man who knew he had overstepped. Clementine was more than angry. She was alarmed. They were not rich. Churchill's ministerial salary as colonial secretary barely covered their London expenses, and his financial habits, expansive, impulsive, unbothered by ledgers, had already frightened her more than once. A country house demanding immediate and expensive repair seemed to her practical Edwardian sensibility an act of recklessness bordering on folly. But Churchill had not bought a house. He had bought the thing the house commanded, 70 miles of visibility southward, a prospect of layered green hills and clouded sky that made him feel, he said, as if he could see France. Standing on the terrace that first summer morning in 1921, he had looked out over land that had not changed in outline since the Middle Ages, ridge, combe, woodland, ploughland, the spire of a village church far off in the haze, and he had seen something that neither salary nor inheritance could easily purchase, the illusion of permanence. He hired Philip Tilden almost immediately. Tilden was a fashionable architect, a man known for sensitive restorations of Tudor and Jacobean houses, a designer who understood how to wrap modern plumbing and electric wiring in the visual language of older England. Between 1922 and 1924, working from an office in Pall Mall and making frequent visits to the site, Tilden effectively rebuilt Chartwell. He kept the bones of the older house, beams, a few fireplaces, a fragment of Tudor walling, but tore away the Victorian excesses and recased the structure in red brick laid in Flemish bond. He installed new drains. He replaced rotted timbers with oak from the estate's own woodlands. He added a 3-story wing projecting southward from the house like the prow of a ship, its stepped gables borrowed from Kent vernacular, its tall windows designed to catch the morning sun and frame the view Churchill had paid for. On the first floor of this new wing, Tilden designed a study. The room was large but not vast, roughly 30 feet by 20, with a ceiling following the slope of the roof, open beams crossing above like the ribs of an inverted hull. The south wall was almost entirely glass, 3 tall windows opening onto the terrace, and beyond it, the Weald. The floor was laid in wide oak planks, not in the usual domestic fashion, boards running parallel to the walls, but arranged in the manner of a ship's quarterdeck, planks aligned as if the room itself were a vessel. It was an eccentric choice, deliberate and costly. The planks had been specially cut and fitted by estate carpenters under Tilden's instruction, their edges tight, their surface planned to a polish that would bear the weight of pacing without creaking. This was not a floor designed for stillness. It was a surface on which a man could walk, turn, walk again, speaking aloud as he moved, working out sentences by the rhythm of footsteps. Churchill moved into Chartwell in the spring of 1924, while painters were still finishing the hall and gardeners were replanting the terraces Tilden had cut into the hillside. The study was complete by then, floor laid, beams finished, bookshelves built into the north wall, but almost empty. There was a desk, a chair, and a lamp. No carpet yet, no banners hanging from the beams, no clutter of papers and books and paint boxes that would eventually make the room look, in photographs, like the workshop of a man who could not bear to throw anything away. In those first weeks, the room was bare oak and blank plaster and light. It smelled of linseed oil and fresh paint. When Churchill walked across it for the first time, his shoes made a hollow sound on the boards, as if the room were listening. He did not yet know what he would do in this room. He knew only that he needed it, a place to work, to think, to write his way out of debts both financial and political. Chartwell had cost far more than £5,000. Tilden's bills were already mounting, and Churchill's income, though substantial by ordinary standards, could not keep pace with his ambitions for the house. More urgently, he needed to rebuild a reputation. His career, brilliant and erratic, had been punctuated by disasters that no amount of wit or eloquence had yet managed to erase. The Dardanelles campaign of 1915, his brainchild, his responsibility, his failure, had cost thousands of lives and ended his tenure as First Lord of the Admiralty. 7 years later, he was back in cabinet, appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer in Stanley Baldwin's Conservative government, but the memory of Gallipoli clung to him like the smell of rot in old timber. He could not undo the past, but he could, perhaps, rewrite it. The quarterdeck floor, empty of footprints in the spring of 1924, waited. Outside, Tilden's workmen were finishing the garden walls. Inside, Churchill unpacked his books and set a ream of foolscap on the desk. The view stretched southward, unchanged. Before Chartwell became a museum, this room was something more dangerous, the place where a politician used architecture to rebuild his own past. By the autumn of 1925, the study at Chartwell had become the nerve center of an improbable dual operation: the management of the British Empire's finances and the production of enough journalistic and literary output to pay for the house from which those finances were managed. Winston Churchill, now Chancellor of the Exchequer, divided his weeks between London and Kent, bringing Treasury red boxes down to Chartwell each weekend and returning them on Monday mornings annotated in his own hand, paragraphs scrawled in the margins, dissenting minutes appended to civil service memoranda. The quarterdeck floor bore the traffic of a man trying to work 2 jobs at once. The room, no longer bare, had begun to accumulate the material symbols of the life Churchill wished to project. The exposed oak beams now carried banners, the heraldic pennants of a Knight of the Garter, conferred in later years, and those of the Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, an ancient ceremonial office he would hold in the 1940s. These honors, draped from the ceiling like the standards in a medieval hall, were anachronistic in a mid-1920s country house. Few politicians of Churchill's generation hung medieval insignia over their desks, but they established the room's symbolic vocabulary. This was not merely a place to work, it was a space in which ancestry, service, and imperial continuity were visibly woven together. On the floor, covering much of the oak planking, lay a Khorasan carpet, deep red and indigo, a gift that would arrive years later from the Shah of Iran, but which, in memory and photographs, seems always to have been there, as if the floor itself required the weight of Persian wool to hold it in place. The walls carried more personal cargo. Portraits of Lord Randolph Churchill and Lady Randolph, Winston's parents, hung in matching frames, their faces watching over the desk where their son worked. Lord Randolph had been a brilliant, erratic politician who burned out young, dying of syphilis at 45, his career a meteor of promise and collapse. His son, now the same age his father had been at his zenith, worked beneath that portrait with a consciousness of inherited drama, the need to succeed where his father had failed, to last longer, to leave a better record. The room, arranged just so, became a kind of stage set for the performance of filial vindication. Every object, banner, portrait, carpet, beam, reinforced the narrative that Churchill was not merely a cabinet minister with a checkered past, but a figure embedded in history, continuity, and destiny. The desk itself sat beneath the south-facing windows, positioned so that Churchill could look up from his papers and see the view that had cost him so much. In the mornings, light poured through the glass, illuminating foolscap and proofs in the chaos of an active working surface. Inkwells, pen nibs, blotting paper, scissors, paste pots for cutting and arranging newspaper clippings, half-finished paintings drying on a side table, books pulled from the shelves and left open, their spines cracked, pages marked with slips of paper. It was, by all contemporary accounts, a room that looked lived in and worked in, a space too busy for tidiness. But the floor remained clear. The quarterdeck planks, whatever else accumulated in the room, were kept swept and polished. Churchill needed the space to pace. His method of composition, already well established by the mid-1920s, was not to sit hunched over a desk, but to walk, dictate, and revise aloud. He employed a rotating staff of secretaries, young women usually, hired for their shorthand speed and their tolerance for irregular hours, who sat at a small side table with notebooks, taking down his words as he moved back and forth across the floor. The room's acoustic properties were ideal for this purpose. The high ceiling and hard surfaces carried his voice without swallowing it, and the rhythm of his pacing, 2 steps, turn, 4 steps, pause, 3 steps, emphatic turn, became inseparable from the rhythm of his sentences. The floor was not decorative. It was a working instrument, the surface on which thought was converted into prose by the motion of feet. Between 1924 and 1929, Churchill drafted 5 annual budgets in this room, speeches that were among the most important and contentious of his career. The 1925 budget, delivered in April, returned Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war parity, a decision that Churchill later acknowledged as the worst mistake of his chancellorship, one that contributed to deflation, unemployment, and the economic misery that culminated in the general strike of 1926. The civil servants who advised him had been divided. The economists who opposed the move, including John Maynard Keynes, were blunt in their warnings. Churchill, pacing the Chartwell study in the weeks before the budget, had dictated and redictated the arguments, weighing orthodoxy against innovation, and had chosen orthodoxy. The floor that spring bore the weight of a decision that would haunt him. Yet the study's primary function, even during these years of active ministerial responsibility, was not governance but production. Churchill needed money, not in the abstract sense of building wealth, but in the immediate pressing sense of paying bills. Chartwell's renovation, initially budgeted at perhaps £8,000 or £10,000, had spiraled far beyond that figure. Tilden's invoices arrived monthly, itemizing work that Churchill had approved without close scrutiny. New drainage systems, extensive re-roofing, the construction of garden walls and terraces, the installation of a heated swimming pool, the building of a small cottage for guests, the landscaping of lakes and water features. By 1926, the total cost was approaching £20,000, more than 4 years of his ministerial salary, and far beyond what he and Clementine could afford from savings or investment income. The solution was to write. Between 1924 and 1929, while serving as Chancellor, Churchill produced a staggering volume of journalism and literary work, newspaper articles, magazine essays, and, most significantly, the first volumes of The World Crisis, his massive 6-volume history of the First World War. The contracts for these works, negotiated by his agents and publishers, brought in sums that dwarfed his government salary. A single magazine article could earn him £100, serialization rights for a book chapter 500 or more. The study at Chartwell became, in effect, a factory, its output measured in words per week and pounds per 1,000 words. Churchill later called it "my workshop," a term that captured both its industrial function and its craftsman's pride. The quarterdeck floor, in these years, was not yet a symbol. It was simply a necessity, the wooden stage on which financial survival was paced out, sentence by sentence, contract by contract. The room looked permanent: oak, banners, portraits, carpet, but its permanence rested on an income stream that required constant, exhausting labor. The study was a country gentleman's private library. In appearance, in function, it was the office of a freelance writer who could not afford to stop. Outside, the Weald lay green and quiet, its contours unchanged since the Middle Ages. Inside, the floor creaked under the footsteps of a man trying to pay for the view. By the winter of 1927, Clementine Churchill was writing letters that documented, in careful understatement, the financial terror that Chartwell had become. "I do beg you not to spend any more money for the present," she wrote to Winston in February, the phrase, "for the present," offering a thin margin of hope that the hemorrhaging might someday stop. The house, barely 3 years old in its rebuilt form, was consuming their income faster than Winston's formidable literary productivity could replenish it. Tilden's bills continued to arrive: final accounts, supplementary charges, fees for work that had never appeared in the original estimates, and each one widened the gap between what the house cost and what they could afford. The problem was not merely that Chartwell was expensive to maintain, though it was. The staff of gardeners, housemaids, cook, butler, and chauffeur required to run an estate of 80 acres and a house of 40 rooms cost more per year than most professional men earned in a lifetime. The deeper problem was that the house was still, in some fundamental sense, unfinished. Churchill could not stop improving it. Every season brought a new project: a garden wall that needed heightening, a pond that should be enlarged, a cottage that could be converted, a studio that might be built so that he could paint without disturbing the household. Each project, conceived as modest, expanded under his enthusiasm until it became another line item in the accounts, another creditor to be placated, another contract to be signed for an article or a book chapter that might, if delivered promptly, cover the shortfall. The architectural history of Chartwell in these years is inseparable from the literary production that paid for it. Between 1926 and 1929, Churchill was writing The World Crisis, a 6-volume history of the First World War that amounted to more than 1 million words. The book was published serially, volume by volume, each installment eagerly awaited by a public still processing the trauma of the war. The contract with Thornton Butterworth, the publisher, was lucrative by the standards of the day, an advance of £10,000 with royalties that would eventually bring the total earnings far higher. But advances are paid out in stages, and Churchill's need for cash was continuous. He wrote at a pace that his secretaries found exhausting, dictating in the study at Chartwell during weekends and holidays, pacing the quarterdeck floor from morning until late at night, pausing only for meals and for the occasional break to paint or lay bricks in the garden, a hobby he had taken up as a form of manual counterpoint to the intellectual labor upstairs. The quarterdeck floor, in these years, bore a kind of economic weight that Tilden had not designed it to carry. Every plank represented hours of dictation, pages of proofs, chapters dispatched to London by the Evening Post. Churchill later described the study as "my factory," a phrase that strips away the romantic gloss of literary production and reveals its industrial reality. The room looked like a gentleman's library: beams, banners, leather-bound volumes ranked on shelves. But it functioned like a piece workshop, where output was measured in words and paid in shillings per 1,000. The floor, polished and cared for, was the factory's assembly line, the surface on which ideas were tested, sentences refined, arguments marshaled. Without it, without the physical act of pacing that accompanied composition, Churchill's method could not work. And without Churchill's method, the house could not be paid for. The world crisis was more than a source of income. It was Churchill's first sustained attempt to control the narrative of events in which he had been a central and often controversial figure. The book's first volumes, published in 1923 and 1924, covered the outbreak of the war and the early naval engagements, arenas in which Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, had exercised significant authority. Later volumes addressed the Dardanelles campaign, the disaster that had ended his Admiralty tenure and cast a shadow over his reputation that no subsequent success had entirely dispelled. In writing The World Crisis, Churchill was not simply recounting history, he was reinterpreting it, using privileged access to official documents, minutes, telegrams, memoranda that he had kept personal copies of, to construct an account in which his decisions appeared, if not vindicated, then at least more reasonable than his critics had suggested. Arthur Balfour, reviewing an early volume, remarked dryly that the book should have been titled The World Crisis by Winston S. Churchill, an autobiography. The comment was acute. The World Crisis was and is a work of extraordinary historical value, detailed, vividly written, sourced from documents that no other contemporary writer could access, but it is also inescapably a work of self-fashioning. The study at Chartwell, where the book was written, was not a neutral workspace. It was the architectural embodiment of Churchill's determination to shape how he would be remembered, a room decorated with symbols of honor and continuity, overlooking a view that suggested permanence, floored with planks that evoked command. The book that emerged from this room bore the imprint of its setting. It was magisterial, defensive, and utterly convinced of its own authority. The irony, lost on no one who knew the household finances, was that the house built to project permanence was teetering on the edge of insolvency. By 1928, Churchill owed money to builders, tradesmen, and his own bank. Clementine's letters from this period carry a note of quiet desperation. She urged economies, fewer servants, smaller dinner parties, a halt to new building projects, but Churchill, incapable of frugality in matters that touched his sense of how life should be lived, continued to spend. He sold investments at a loss. He took on more journalism, churning out articles for American magazines at rates that astonished his British publishers. He signed contracts for books not yet written, accepting advances against future work, a financial strategy that kept the creditors at bay but bound him to an exhausting treadmill of production. The quarterdeck floor during these years became something more than a surface for pacing. It became a ledger written in oak, each plank a contract, each step a paragraph, each crossing and recrossing a small payment against the accumulated debt. Churchill later claimed with characteristic bravado that he had paid for Chartwell with my pen. The claim was not, strictly speaking, true. He had also used his inheritance, his salary, and loans from friends, but it captured a fundamental truth about the relationship between the house and the work. Chartwell compelled him to write, and the writing paid for Chartwell. The study, the room at the heart of this circular engine, was both the site of production and its justification. It was the place where financial need was converted into narrative ambition, where the pressure to pay bills became the discipline that produced books. By the end of the decade, the house was stable, if not secure. The worst of Tilden's bills had been paid. The staff was established. The gardens, terraced and planted, were beginning to mature into the landscape Churchill had envisioned. The study, its shelves now full, its desk piled high with the ongoing work of governance and literature, had settled into its role as the center of Churchill's working life. The view from the south-facing windows remained what it had always been, the long slope of the Weald, green in summer, misted in autumn, occasionally white with snow in winter, always present, always unchanging. The floor beneath had carried him through. What it would carry him toward remained in 1929, uncertain. But the room was ready. The floor was sound. The archive was growing. In the spring of 1930, Winston Churchill was no longer Chancellor of the Exchequer. The Conservative government had fallen in the general election of May 1929, and Churchill, along with his party, was out of office. At 55, he returned to Chartwell not as a temporary weekend visitor, but as a man whose daily life, for the first time in years, centered on the house. The study on the first floor, which had served as an adjunct to his ministerial work, now became his primary occupation. He had always been a writer. Now he was almost nothing else. The transformation of Chartwell from weekend retreat to full-time workshop was abrupt and, for Churchill, disorienting. Power, once held, shapes the rhythm of days, meetings, dispatches, decisions that must be made by deadlines not of one's own choosing. Out of office, Churchill lost that external structure. He was left with the house, the view, and the knowledge that his political career, which had seemed to be reaching a second peak during his tenure at the Treasury, had stalled in a way that felt ominously familiar. He had been out of power before. After the Dardanelles, he had spent years in what he later called the wilderness. But this exile felt different. He was older. His party was divided. The issues on which he cared most deeply, India, rearmament, the empire, were moving in directions he opposed, and he had no platform from which to resist. So he wrote. In the early 1930s, the study at Chartwell became the headquarters of a one-man literary operation whose scale and output rivaled that of a small publishing house. Churchill was working simultaneously on multiple projects: the final volumes of The World Crisis, a full-length biography of his ancestor John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, newspaper articles for British and American publications, and a steady stream of political essays, most of them attacks on the Baldwin government's policy toward India, and warnings about the rise of European dictatorships. The sheer volume of words produced in the room during these years is difficult to credit. Hundreds of thousands of words per year, all dictated aloud while pacing the quarterdeck floor, all revised in proof, all dispatched to publishers and editors with a speed that Churchill's secretaries found relentless. Grace Hamblin, who joined the household staff in the early 1930s and remained until Churchill's death, later recalled the rhythm of work in the study. Churchill typically rose late. He was not a morning person and spent the early afternoon reading newspapers, answering correspondence, and managing estate business. By mid-afternoon, he would retreat to the study, and the real work would begin. He dictated standing up, using a lectern-style desk built by a local carpenter to hold his books and papers at chest height. The desk was not elegant. It was a functional object, heavy oak with a slanted top, more like something one might find in a church than a country house. But it served its purpose, to keep him on his feet, moving, engaged with the material in a way that sitting at a conventional desk did not allow. The dictation sessions could last for hours. Churchill walked in a rough oval circuit around the room, his hands often clasped behind his back or gesturing as he shaped a sentence, his voice rising and falling with the cadence of the prose. He revised as he spoke, stopping mid-sentence to substitute a word, backtracking to rephrase an entire paragraph, occasionally interrupting himself to check a date or a reference in one of the books open on the lectern. The secretaries, seated at a smaller table near the windows, took down everything in shorthand, their pens, scratching steadily across the page, only rarely asking him to slow down. The quarterdeck floor, under this repeated traffic, developed faint paths, areas where the varnish wore thinner, where the oak took on a softer sheen from the repeated pressure of Churchill's pacing. The room, to anyone who entered it during these years, felt charged with purposeful energy, a space organized entirely around the production of words. The Marlborough biography, which occupied much of Churchill's attention between 1932 and 1938, was a project of extraordinary ambition. Marlborough. His Life and Times eventually ran to 4 volumes and more than 1 million words, a work of historical scholarship that required access to archives in England and across Europe. Churchill hired research assistants, young historians, often recent Oxford graduates, who spent months in libraries and country house munition rooms, transcribing letters, copying dispatches, and sending boxes of notes back to Chartwell. The biography was, on one level, a work of filial piety. Churchill admired his ancestor and wished to rescue Marlborough's reputation from the attacks of Whig historians who had portrayed the Duke as a traitor and a mercenary. But the book was also, more subtly, an exercise in self-projection. Marlborough, like Churchill, had been a brilliant and controversial figure, a man who had risen to power, fallen from favor, and been vindicated by events. The parallels were too close to be accidental. In writing Marlborough's life, Churchill was constructing a template for his own, the story of a man whose warnings were ignored, whose methods were questioned, and whose ultimate success proved the doubters wrong. The study, during these years of political exile, became a place where official memory and private anxiety met. Churchill had privileged access to documents from his time in government, cabinet minutes, admiralty telegrams, memoranda from the War Council, most of which he had retained personal copies of, a practice that was not, strictly speaking, proper, but which no one had moved to stop. These documents, stored in filing cabinets and document boxes in the study, were mined extensively for both the world crisis and the articles he wrote in the 1930s. The room functioned, in effect, as a private archive, a repository of primary sources that Churchill could consult without the oversight of government archivists or the restrictions that applied to official records. It gave him an immense advantage over other writers and historians. He was not merely recounting history, he was doing so with the documentary record literally at his fingertips, arranged on his own shelves, indexed according to his own system. This privileged access was also a kind of power, not the power to make policy, which he had lost, but the power to shape how policy would be remembered. The study at Chartwell in the early 1930s was not a site of political action. It was a site of narrative, construction, a place where a man out of office was building a literary bulwark against the oblivion he feared. Churchill later expressed the sentiment, in various forms, that history would judge him kindly because he intended to write it. The remark has become famous, often quoted as an example of his wit, but it was more than a joke. It was a statement of method. He understood that the past is not fixed but constructed, that the version of events that survives is often the version most compellingly told, and that the historian with access to the best documents and the most vivid prose has an enormous influence over what future generations believe happened. The quarterdeck floor at Chartwell was where this understanding was put into practice. By 1934, the political landscape was darkening in ways that gave Churchill a new cause and, eventually, a new audience. The study, which had been the refuge of an out-of-office politician writing about the past, was about to become the headquarters of a campaign aimed squarely at the future. From the autumn of 1934 onward, the study at Chartwell acquired a dual character. It remained a workshop for historical writing, but it also became a base for political agitation. Churchill, frustrated by his party's leadership and alarmed by reports from Germany, began to use the room not merely to dictate books, but to draft speeches, write articles, and prepare broadcast scripts aimed at warning Britain of the dangers of disarmament in the face of German rearmament. The quarterdeck floor, which had borne the pacing of historical reconstruction, now carried the rhythm of a different kind of campaign, one focused not on the past, but on an immediate and gathering threat. The speeches and articles that Churchill produced at Chartwell during the mid-1930s form one of the most striking bodies of political rhetoric in 20th century British history. They were not always well received at the time. Many contemporaries found them alarmist, overstated, or tainted by Churchill's reputation for erratic judgment. But in retrospect, they established Churchill as one of the few British politicians who grasped early and clearly the nature of the threat posed by Nazi Germany. The study where these warnings were written has, in collective memory, become a kind of sacred space, the room where prescience was born. But at the time, it was simply a place where a man without power tried, with limited success, to get people to listen. On 16 November 1934, Churchill delivered a BBC radio broadcast from London. He was not yet using Chartwell for broadcasts, though he would in later years, in which he warned that Britain faced an old grim choice, whether we shall be the slave or the master, whether we shall preserve our freedom or lose it. The script for that broadcast had been drafted at Chartwell, revised over several days on the study floor, its phrasing tested aloud as Churchill paced between the windows and the lectern. The broadcast was heard by millions, but it produced little immediate political effect. The government's policy of disarmament continued. The public, exhausted by the memory of the Great War and eager to believe that such catastrophe could be avoided by negotiation and goodwill, was not inclined to heed warnings that pointed toward rearmament and confrontation. Churchill continued regardless. Between 1934 and 1938, he gave dozens of speeches in Parliament and at public meetings, wrote scores of articles for newspapers and magazines, and used every available platform to argue that Britain's air defenses were dangerously inadequate and that Germany, under Hitler, was rearming at a pace that would soon give it overwhelming military superiority. Much of this work was prepared at Chartwell. The study's desk was covered with maps, intelligence reports, some official, some leaked by sympathetic civil servants and military officers who shared Churchill's concerns, and draft after draft of speeches. The banners hanging from the beams, symbols of an older England, of continuity and tradition, looked down on a room that was now preoccupied with the mechanics of modern war: bombers, fighters, radar systems, and the calculus of air power. The physical setting of the study framed these warnings in ways that Churchill must have been conscious of. The room, with its oak beams, its heraldic banners, and its view over the quiet Kentish countryside, evoked a version of England that was pastoral, rooted, and seemingly far removed from the industrial violence of total war. Yet, it was from this room that Churchill dictated some of his starkest assessments of what that violence would look like if it came. The contrast was deliberate. Churchill's rhetoric during these years often invoked the image of England as a green and pleasant land, a place of villages and churches and fields, threatened by forces that cared nothing for such things. The study, architecturally coded to suggest tradition and continuity, became a platform from which to argue that tradition and continuity were precisely what was at stake, and what would be lost if the warnings went unheeded. Visitors to Chartwell during these years sometimes recorded their impressions of the study. One described it as feeling like a half-library, half-command post, a room where the apparatus of scholarship, books, papers, maps, coexisted with a sense of urgency more commonly associated with a military headquarters. The quarterdeck floor contributed to this impression. Its planks, laid in the manner of a ship's deck, suggested movement, readiness, and the possibility of decisive action. But the action, such as it was, consisted only of words, speeches delivered to audiences that were often indifferent, articles published in newspapers that many dismissed as scaremongering. Churchill had no troops to command, no ministry to direct. He had only the study, the floor, and the stubborn conviction that he was right. It is worth noting that Chartwell, for all its symbolic weight in Churchill's life, was a relatively modest estate by the standards of the British aristocracy. It had 80 acres, enough to be called a country house, but far short of the thousands of acres that surrounded the seats of dukes and earls. The house itself, while comfortable, was not architecturally distinguished. Nicholas Pevsner, the great architectural historian, barely mentioned Chartwell in his survey of Kent buildings, noting only that it was rebuilt in the 1920s and offering no further comment. Britannica, in its entry on Chartwell, describes the house as undistinguished architecturally. This was not Blenheim, the vast ducal palace where Churchill had been born. It was the home of a man who was, by birth, the son of a younger son, gentry rather than high nobility, comfortable rather than grand. But what Chartwell lacked in architectural pedigree, it made up for in the way it was used. Churchill's authority, during the wilderness years, was rhetorical rather than institutional. He held no office. He commanded no party apparatus. His power, such as it was, lay entirely in his ability to argue, to warn, to articulate a vision of danger, and to do so with a command of language that few could match. The study at Chartwell was the workshop where that rhetorical power was honed. The floor, paced daily, was the surface on which sentences were tested for rhythm and force. The room, arranged to project continuity and purpose, was the setting from which warnings issued that would, in time, be recognized as prophetic. But prophecy is a term applied only in retrospect. At the time, Churchill's speeches failed to move governments. The policy of appeasement continued. In 1938, after the Munich Agreement, Neville Chamberlain returned to London claiming peace for our time, and the majority of the British public believed him. Churchill, speaking in the Commons, called the agreement a total and unmitigated defeat. He was shouted down. The words that would later be cited as proof of his prescience were, at the moment they were delivered, evidence only of his isolation. The study at Chartwell during these years was a place of failure as much as foresight. The warnings drafted there were ignored. The speeches paced out on its floor changed nothing. Yet the room continued to function. Churchill continued to write, the quarterdeck boards continued to carry his footsteps, and the words, filed away in drafts and clippings and secretaries' notebooks, were preserved, ready to be retrieved years later when the time came to write a different kind of history. In the late summer of 1936, on a warm afternoon when the French windows of the study stood open and the scent of roses drifted up from the terrace, T. Lawrence arrived at Chartwell for lunch. Lawrence of Arabia, though he loathed the epithet and had changed his name to Shaw in an effort to escape it, was living in Mamerndon's semi-retirement in Dorset, working as an RAF aircraftsman and writing letters to friends in which he expressed both satisfaction with obscurity and a lingering restlessness about his exclusion from the political world. Churchill had invited him to discuss, among other things, the situation in the Middle East and the question of British air power. Lawrence came, they talked, and later that afternoon, Churchill showed him the study. The room by 1936 had accumulated layers of use and decoration that made it feel less like a workspace and more like a kind of personal museum. The banners still hung from the beams, the Persian carpet covered much of the floor, the portraits of Lord and Lady Randolph still watched from the walls. But now there were additions, photographs of political figures and military commanders, some signed, a collection of walking sticks in a stand near the door, boxes of cigars stacked on a side table, and, increasingly, Churchill's own paintings, landscapes mostly, completed during his breaks from dictation, propped against the bookshelves or hung in simple frames. The room had become a portrait in 3 dimensions of its occupant, eclectic, crowded, saturated with the artifacts of a life lived at the intersection of politics, war, literature, and art. Lawrence's visit was one of many during the 1930s. Chartwell, despite Churchill's political isolation, remained a gathering place for a certain kind of visitor. Writers, artists, military men, politicians who shared his views or simply enjoyed his company. Walter Sickert, the painter, came to give Churchill informal lessons in technique and sometimes joined him in the garden studio, a small outbuilding where Churchill worked on his canvases. Frederick Lindemann, the Oxford physicist, who would later serve as Churchill's scientific advisor during the war, was a frequent guest, offering tutorials on everything from quantum mechanics to nutrition. Politicians from the anti-appeasement wing of the Conservative Party, figures like Brendan Bracken and Harold Macmillan, visited to discuss strategy and share intelligence about Germany. The house, and especially the study, functioned as a kind of shadow headquarters for an opposition movement that had no formal structure and little political power. Family life, meanwhile, continued around the edges of this political and literary activity. Churchill's children, Diana, Randolph, Sarah, and Mary, were variously present at Chartwell during the 1930s, depending on their ages and circumstances. Randolph, the only son, was often at odds with his father, a relationship marked by affection and exasperation in roughly equal measure. Mary, the youngest, later wrote the most detailed memoirs of life at Chartwell, describing the house as a place of both warmth and formality, where childhood routines, meals, games, swims in the pool, coexisted with the knowledge that her father was engaged in work of great seriousness upstairs. Clementine, managing the household and the finances, remained wary of the costs, but had by now accepted that Chartwell was permanent, for better or worse. The estate itself had matured into the vision Churchill had held for it. The gardens, designed in collaboration with landscape architects and built with Churchill's active participation, he laid many of the brick walls himself, a hobby that gave him satisfaction and occasionally blistered his hands, were now established features of the property. There were terraces, water gardens, a series of ponds stocked with golden orf, and a swimming pool kept heated even in winter, which Churchill used almost daily. The lawns, the woodlands, the kitchen gardens, tended by staff, all combined to create a landscape that suggested continuity and care. Chartwell, in the late 1930s, looked like the home of a man who intended to stay. But beneath this surface stability, the old financial pressures remained. The house was expensive to run. Churchill's income, while substantial, depended entirely on his ability to keep writing, and writing at the pace he had established was exhausting even for a man of his energy. He was now in his 60s. The long hours of dictation, the constant travel to London for parliamentary sessions, the strain of arguing positions that few shared, all of this took a toll. He suffered occasional bouts of what he called his black dog, periods of depression that left him listless and irritable. The study, during these episodes, could feel less like a workshop and more like a burden, the desk piled with work that had to be done, the floor a surface that had to be paced whether he felt like pacing or not. Yet, he continued. By 1938, with war increasingly likely, Churchill's warnings had begun to find a wider audience. The Munich crisis of September, when Chamberlain flew to meet Hitler and returned with an agreement that ceded parts of Czechoslovakia to Germany, crystallized the divide between appeasers and Churchill's camp. The study at Chartwell in the weeks following Munich was the site of intense activity. Drafts of speeches denouncing the agreement, articles for the press, correspondence with political allies and with Czechs and others directly affected by the policy. The quarterdeck floor, worn now by more than a decade of pacing, bore the weight of Churchill's anger and his determination to keep arguing. The room, during these years, was also a place where the private and the political intersected in ways that were not always comfortable. Churchill's ambitions for his family, particularly for Randolph, were bound up with his sense of dynasty and legacy. He wanted Randolph to have a political career, to carry forward the Churchill name in ways that would vindicate both Winston's own efforts and his father's thwarted promise. But Randolph, though gifted, was erratic and often self-destructive, and the attempts to launch his political career repeatedly failed. The study, where father and son sometimes argued late into the evening, held the echoes of these disappointments. The view from the windows, meanwhile, remained unchanged, the long prospect southward over the Weald, the hills and fields and woods that Churchill had bought the house to command. But the view was no longer simply a landscape, it was also increasingly a front line. By 1938, the fear of aerial bombardment, of German bombers flying up the Thames estuary and over Kent on their way to London, was no longer theoretical. The study's south-facing windows, which had once framed a pastoral scene, now looked out over an airspace that Churchill, in his speeches and articles, warned would soon be contested. The Kentish countryside, so peaceful in the afternoon light, was geographically positioned directly beneath the likely path of attack. As the decade closed, the study at Chartwell remained what it had been, a workspace, a political headquarters, a family room, an archive. But the meaning of the floor beneath, those quarterdeck planks polished and worn, was beginning to shift. They had carried the pacing of a man trying to reshape his own past. Soon, they would stand empty, silent, while the man who had walked them went elsewhere to command a war. The house, built to project permanence, was about to become a temporary absence. On 3rd September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and within days, Chartwell was judged too vulnerable to serve as Winston Churchill's primary residence. The house sat on a prominent hilltop in Kent, clearly visible from the air, and the lakes and ponds that Churchill had so lovingly constructed now posed a different kind of problem. They were large, reflective, and could serve as navigational landmarks for German bombers following the Thames estuary toward London. By mid-September, on the advice of security officials, the ponds had been covered with netting and camouflage, and Churchill, who had been recalled to government as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same post he had held at the outbreak of the First World War, spent most of his time either in London or at Admiralty House. Chartwell, for the first time since its reconstruction, stood largely empty. The study on the first floor was closed but not abandoned. Furniture remained in place. The desk under the south windows, the lectern, the bookshelves, the banners hanging from the beams. Dust began to settle on the quarterdeck planks. The carpets were rolled and stored. The windows, which had always been left uncurtained to admit the maximum light and the maximum view, were now fitted with blackout blinds in compliance with wartime regulations. The room that had been defined by its openness, to light, to landscape, to the traffic of visitors and secretaries, was sealed and darkened. It became, for the duration of the war, an architectural parenthesis, a space suspended between its past function and its future significance. Churchill visited Chartwell occasionally during the war. Years, but rarely for long. Clementine came more frequently, checking on the house and overseeing the reduced staff who kept the property minimally maintained. The gardens, without their full complement of gardeners, began to revert to wildness. The terraces grew weeds, the ponds, netted and neglected, filled with leaves. The house itself, unheated for long periods, developed the particular chill and mustiness of buildings left largely unoccupied. The study, when Clementine walked through it on her visits, felt like a museum exhibit of a life interrupted, everything in place, nothing in use. Yet, even as the study stood empty, the archival structure that would define its post-war importance was being created elsewhere. Churchill, throughout the war, maintained an obsessive attention to documentation. He insisted that his personal minutes, the stream of directives, queries, and observations that he sent to ministers, generals, and civil servants, be preserved and indexed. He had learned, during the writing of the world crisis, the value of having one's own records. Now, as Prime Minister from May 1940 onward, he was creating a similar archive on a vastly larger scale. Every week, his secretariat compiled a printed digest of his most important correspondence and memoranda, copies of which were set aside for his personal files. These documents, eventually numbering in the tens of thousands of pages, were stored in London during the war, but with the clear understanding that they would, at some point, return to Chartwell. Churchill's determination to be one of the historians of the Second World War, a phrase he used in conversation during the conflict, shaped not only what documents were preserved, but how they were preserved. He wanted a record that would support a narrative in which his decisions appeared necessary, his warnings vindicated, his leadership justified. The study at Chartwell, though physically absent from the war, was always conceptually present in his planning. It was the place to which he intended to return, the floor he would pace again, the desk at which he would sit to write the history of the war he was, during those years, still fighting. The room's authority, in this sense, rested not on what happened in it during the war. Almost nothing did, but on what would be written there afterward. The years of the study's greatest emptiness were also the years that would make it most famous. The quarterdeck floor, gathering dust, was waiting for the story it would bear. By 1945, the house had survived the war intact. Unlike many country estates which were requisitioned by the military, converted into hospitals or training centers, or simply neglected to the point of ruin, Chartwell had been left alone, too small and too exposed to be useful, too well connected to be seized. The garden ponds were uncovered, the blackout blinds were taken down. The study's windows once again looked out over the Weald, which itself had survived the war. No major battles fought on its hills, no bombs falling in significant numbers on the fields Churchill had bought the house to view. The landscape was unchanged. What had changed was the meaning of the room that overlooked it. When the lights came back on at Chartwell, they illuminated a war already being rearranged on paper. On 26 July 1945, the results of the British general election were announced, and Winston Churchill, the man who had led Britain through its darkest years into victory in Europe, was out of office. The Labour Party, under Clement Attlee, had won a landslide. Churchill, who had expected a victory, or at worst a narrow defeat, was stunned. He returned to Chartwell a few days later, exhausted and bewildered, to a house he had barely lived in for 6 years. The study on the first floor waited, exactly as he had left it in 1939, except that now it was a place to which a dismissed prime minister retreated rather than a place from which a first lord departed. The physical condition of the house mirrored, in some ways, Churchill's own state. He was 70 years old. The war had aged him. Photographs from 1945 show a face heavy with fatigue, eyes that had seen too much, a body that had carried enormous strain, and was now being asked to carry the weight of rejection. Chartwell itself needed work. 6 years of minimal maintenance had left the house shabby, paint flaking, roof tiles missing, gardens overgrown. The study, while structurally sound, felt cold and underused. The quarterdeck floor, when Churchill first walked across it again after the election, creaked in ways it had not before. Or perhaps he simply noticed, for the first time, how old the wood had become. But defeat, for all its bitterness, gave Churchill something he had not had in years, time. He was no longer responsible for the direction of a war or the governance of an empire. His days were his own. And he had, immediately pressing, a project that would both occupy that time and offer a form of vindication. Before the election, he had already begun discussions with publishers about the history of the Second World War. Now, out of office, he could devote himself to it fully. The study at Chartwell, so long a place for writing about the past, would now become the place where the immediate past, events barely concluded, would be shaped into the history that future generations would read. The publishing contracts, when finalized, were extraordinary. Churchill negotiated deals with publishers on both sides of the Atlantic that would bring him, over the course of the project, more money than he had earned in his entire previous literary career. The sums were not merely large, they were transformative. For the first time since he had bought Chartwell in 1922, Churchill would be financially secure. The house that had been a source of constant anxiety, a drain on income, a burden that required endless literary labor to sustain, would finally be paid for, not by journalism or by incremental book advances, but by a single massive project rooted in the very events that had made the house uninhabitable during the war. A. L. Rouse, the historian, visited Chartwell in 1955 and recorded his impressions of Churchill in the study. By then, the work on the Second World War was complete, but Rose's description captures the atmosphere of the room as it had been during the late 1940s. He showed me into his study, the room where it was all done. It was more like a workshop than a study, papers everywhere, books pulled from shelves, proofs stacked on every surface, and that floor, he told me he'd paced it so many times writing the war volumes that he'd worn paths in the varnish. He seemed proud of that, as if the wear itself were proof of work done. The quarterdeck floor, once again, became a surface for pacing. Churchill's method had not changed. He still dictated, still walked as he spoke, still employed secretaries who sat with shorthand notebooks taking down his words. But the scale of the project was unprecedented. The Second World War would eventually run to 6 volumes and more than 1 million words, a work of history so detailed and so vividly written that it has shaped, more than any other single source, how the English-speaking world understands the conflict. The study at Chartwell was where the first drafts of this history were created, and the floor was the engine that drove the drafting. But the room also became, during these years, a place where loss was felt. Churchill's mood in the late 1940s was often dark. He had saved Britain, but Britain had voted him out. He had led the alliance that defeated Nazi Germany, but the peace was already fracturing into a new Cold War that he had warned about, an iron curtain, he said in a speech at Fulton, Missouri in 1946, in which he had no power to prevent. The study, for all its productivity, was also a place where a man confronted the limits of what victory had brought him. Fame, yes, security, eventually, but not the political continuity he had assumed would be his reward. The view from the south windows remained what it had always been. The Weald, green and quiet, offered no answers, but it offered constancy, and in those years, constancy was what Churchill needed. The floor, worn by pacing, bore him through. Outside, the landscape was healing from the war. Inside, the study was preparing to tell the war's story. Between 1946 and 1951, the study at Chartwell functioned as the command center for a literary operation that involved not only Churchill, but a team of assistants, researchers, and editors who treated the house as if it were a wartime headquarters. The project was the Second World War, and its creation involved a level of institutional support unusual for a work ostensibly authored by a single individual. Churchill had help, extensive, organized, and sometimes directive help, and much of that help arrived at Chartwell by car, briefcase in hand, carrying documents, drafts, and notes that would be discussed, revised, and incorporated into the volumes. The syndicate, as Churchill's team was informally called, included historians, former military officers, and civil servants who devoted years to assisting with the book. Dennis Kelly, a young researcher with a background in military history, became one of the key figures, traveling to Chartwell regularly to work with Churchill on structure, sources, and narrative. Bill Deacon, an Oxford Don who had worked with Churchill on the Marlborough biography in the 1930s, returned to help with research and fact-checking. General Hastings Ismay, who had served as Churchill's chief military assistant during the war, provided input on military operations and helped secure access to classified documents. These men, and others, effectively formed a collaborative enterprise, though the books bore only Churchill's name on the title page. The collaboration extended beyond research into the actual text. Sir Norman Brooke, the cabinet secretary, vetted drafts of several volumes before publication, striking out passages that might embarrass the government or reveal information still considered sensitive. In some cases, Brooke rewrote sections himself, smoothing over controversies or softening Churchill's more pointed criticisms of wartime allies. The archives contain correspondence in which Brooke suggests, with bureaucratic politeness, that certain claims be reconsidered or that particular anecdotes be omitted in the interest of discretion. Churchill, needing the government's cooperation to access official documents, usually complied. The result was a work of immense historical value and equally immense ambiguity. The Second World War is detailed, vivid, and sourced from documents that no other contemporary writer could access. Churchill had lived the events he was describing. He had written many of the minutes and telegrams that he now quoted. The book's immediacy, its sense of being written from inside the events themselves, gives it a unique authority. But it is also, inescapably, a work of self-justification. Decisions that were controversial at the time are presented in Churchill's account as necessary and vindicated by events. Mistakes are acknowledged, but usually with explanations that deflect blame or emphasize mitigating circumstances. Dissenting voices, colleagues who had questioned Churchill's judgment, allies who had resisted his strategies, are given less space than Churchill's own perspective. Critics, then and since, have pointed out that the Second World War is not, strictly speaking, history in the academic sense. It is memoir, argument, and apologia, shaped by the author's need to be seen in a particular light. David Reynolds, a historian who has studied the creation of the book, notes that Churchill wrote to vindicate his own record and to shape how the war would be remembered. The study at Chartwell, where the book was written, was less a historian's archive than a politician's workshop, a place where documents were selected, narratives were crafted, and inconvenient details were quietly set aside. The quarterdeck floor, during these years, bore the weight of this ambiguity. Churchill paced it, dictating passages that were factually accurate, but selectively framed. He walked across it, revising proofs that smoothed over conflicts and controversies. The floor, with its nautical echo of command and control, was the surface on which history was not so much recorded as arranged. The room's banners, its portraits, its view over the unchanging Weald, all of these elements contributed to an atmosphere in which Churchill's version of events felt authoritative, settled, and permanent. But authority is not the same as objectivity, and the study, for all its careful decoration, could not alter the fact that the history being written there was also a history being edited to serve its author's reputation. The volumes appeared one by one between 1948 and 1954. Each was greeted with acclaim, serialized in newspapers, translated into dozens of languages, and awarded prizes. The final volume, Triumph and Tragedy, was published in 1953, the same year Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his mastery of historical and biographical description, as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. The prize was, in part, recognition of the Second World War, and it confirmed the book's status as a canonical text. The study at Chartwell, where the work had been written, was now the study where a Nobel laureate had written. The quarterdeck floor had carried him to a place beyond political defeat, but the price of this achievement was a history that future generations would have to read with caution, aware that the man who wrote it had walked a floor designed to evoke command while writing a book designed to justify the commands he had given. The study that once amplified his warnings now muffled some of his mistakes. In the summer of 1946, even as Churchill was beginning work on the Second World War, the future of Chartwell itself was uncertain. The house, though now secured by the book contracts, remained expensive to maintain. Churchill was 71, Clementine was 61, and the physical demands of managing an 80-acre estate were becoming more burdensome. The question of what would happen to the house after their deaths had begun to press on both of them. Churchill did not want Chartwell sold to strangers, or, worse, subdivided and demolished, a fate that was overtaking many country houses in post-war Britain as estates were broken up to pay death duties and meet the demands of an economy that no longer supported the landed gentry in the old way. The solution came not from Churchill's family, but from his friends. In late 1946, a consortium of 17 wealthy men, led by Lord Camrose, the newspaper proprietor, raised $50,000 to purchase Chartwell and transfer it to the National Trust, the organization responsible for preserving historic houses and landscapes. The agreement included a clause granting Winston and Clementine a life tenancy, meaning they could continue to live in the house until their deaths, after which it would be open to the public. The arrangement was unusual but not unprecedented. The National Trust had accepted similar gifts before, and Chartwell, as the home of a wartime prime minister and a major literary figure, was clearly a property of national significance. The legal documents transferring ownership were signed in early 1947. Churchill expressed gratitude in private letters, acknowledging that the gift relieved him of a burden he had carried for decades. "I am free now to work without the shadow of financial ruin hanging over the house," he wrote to Camrose. Clementine, in her own correspondence, was more blunt. She was relieved that the house would not have to be sold and that their children would not inherit an unsustainable financial obligation. The transfer to the National Trust marked a subtle but profound shift in Chartwell's status. It was no longer simply a private home. It was now a house with a future public life already guaranteed, a property that would, inevitably, become a museum. The rooms, and especially the study, were now understood not just as spaces where Churchill lived and worked, but as spaces that would, after his death, be preserved and displayed as historical artifacts. The quarterdeck floor, which Churchill still paced daily, was now a floor that would one day be walked by visitors, or more likely, observed from behind a velvet rope. It had been pre-designated as heritage. This transformation had practical consequences. Churchill, always conscious of posterity, became even more deliberate about what he kept and how he arranged the study. Documents, letters, and manuscripts that might have been discarded were now filed away with the knowledge that they would eventually be part of the house's historical record. The room's decoration, already layered with symbols of honor and continuity, was maintained with an awareness that it would one day be interpreted by curators and guidebook writers. The study, in its final years of active use, was simultaneously a workspace and a future museum exhibit, and Churchill, pacing its floor, was both a writer at work and a historical figure arranging the stage on which his memory would be displayed. The network that saved Chartwell was not a democratic coalition of ordinary citizens, but a group of wealthy men, industrialists, press barons, financiers, who had the means to raise $50,000 and the connections to coordinate such an effort. This was the same class that had gathered at Chartwell for weekends in the 1930s, the same circle that had supported Churchill during his wilderness years, the same elite that had always formed the core of his social and political base. The house was saved, but it was saved by a system of patronage and private wealth that was itself fading in post-war Britain. The National Trust, as an institution, depended on such donations to preserve the country houses that were, in many cases, too expensive for their owners to maintain and too historically significant to let fall into ruin. Chartwell's survival, then, was not inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people with the resources to make them. Another house, equally significant but less well-connected, might have been lost. Another politician, less famous or less fortunate in his friends, might have seen his home demolished or converted. The study at Chartwell survived because Winston Churchill had friends who could write large checks, and because those friends believed that the house where Churchill had written his books and planned his campaigns was worth preserving. But preservation has its costs. The house, once saved, was no longer entirely Churchill's. It belonged, in law, to the National Trust. It belonged, in expectation, to the future public that would visit it. The study, still in daily use, was already slipping into the past tense, a room whose significance lay not in what was happening there now, but in what had happened there before. The quarterdeck floor, creaking under Churchill's footsteps in the late 1940s, was carrying a man who had become, in his own lifetime, a historical figure whose house was a monument. The house was saved. Its story, increasingly, would be the one written on its quarterdeck. On 24 January 1965, Winston Churchill died in London at the age of 90, and Chartwell, which had been his home for more than 40 years, passed definitively out of the realm of private life and into the keeping of history. Clementine, as agreed in the 1947 settlement with the National Trust, surrendered her life tenancy rights, and in March 1966, the house opened to the public. The transformation from working residence to museum was swift and, by all accounts, carefully managed. The National Trust's curators worked with Clementine and with Churchill's surviving staff to arrange the rooms as they had appeared during Churchill's most productive years, generally understood to mean the 1920s and 1930s, before the war interrupted his residence. The study on the first floor was treated with particular care. The desk remained in place beneath the south windows, its surface arranged with items that suggested recent use: papers, pens, a lamp, an ashtray. The lectern, the improvised standing desk that Churchill had used for dictation, stood where it had always stood. The bookshelves, filled with volumes that Churchill had consulted, histories, memoirs, reference works, bound volumes of Hansard, were left undisturbed. The banners still hung from the beams. The Persian carpet still covered much of the quarterdeck floor, though now it was pinned and protected to prevent wear. The room was arranged, in the Abbey curator's phrase, to look exactly as he left it, though of course no room ever left untouched looks exactly as it did in life. The absence of a living presence is itself a transformation. Early guidebooks to Chartwell, published in the late 1960s and 1970s, emphasized the study as the heart of the house, the room where Churchill's most important work had been done. Photographs in these guides show the space as it remains today: the desk, the windows, the view, the floor. Visitors were, and are, invited to imagine Churchill at work, pacing, dictating, pausing to look out over the Weald. The quarterdeck floor, which had once been worn by the traffic of active composition, was now walked on only by conservation staff and, very occasionally, by privileged visitors granted access beyond the velvet ropes. For most people, the floor became something observed, a surface seen but not touched, part of a tableau arranged to evoke a moment that could no longer be inhabited. The shift from workshop to museum room was subtle but total. The study, as a museum space, served a function opposite to its original purpose. It no longer produced narrative, it staged it. The room had become a three-dimensional footnote to the volumes that Churchill had written there, a physical illustration of the conditions under which the world crisis, Marlborough, and the Second World War had been composed. Visitors who had read those books or who knew Churchill's reputation from his wartime speeches could stand outside the study — the room is not generally open for visitors to enter — and see the place where words had been turned into history. The quarterdeck floor, visible through the doorway, became a kind of relic, not sacred exactly, but treated with the reverence usually reserved for objects that have touched greatness. The National Trust's early interpretation of Chartwell was, by the standards of the 1960s and 1970s, straightforward and celebratory. The guidebooks praised Churchill's leadership, his literary achievements, his prescience in warning against Nazi Germany. The study was presented as the workshop of a great man, a room where history had been both made and recorded. There was little interrogation of the narratives Churchill had created, little acknowledgement that the books written in the study were, in some respects, acts of self-justification as much as acts of history. The floor, polished and preserved, bore no visible trace of ambiguity. Visitor numbers were strong from the beginning. Chartwell quickly became one of the National Trust's most popular properties, drawing tens of thousands of visitors each year. People came to see the house where Churchill had lived, to walk the gardens he had built, to stand in front of the study and imagine him at work. The appeal was both historical and emotional. This was a place where a figure of immense significance had lived an ordinary domestic life, a place where the grand narrative of 20th century history, intersected with the mundane details of bricks, gardens, and rooms. The quarterdeck floor, glimpsed through the doorway, was part of that appeal, a tangible object, worn by use, that connected visitors to the man who had walked it. But even as the room was frozen in place, Churchill's reputation beyond its walls was beginning to move. The study remained unchanged. The questions brought to it did not. By the 1980s and 1990s, historians and biographers had begun to complicate the image of Churchill that had dominated public memory in the years immediately after his death. The reassessment was not wholesale. Churchill's role in defeating Nazi Germany remained central to his legacy, but it was substantial. Scholars began to examine more closely his views on empire, race, and colonialism, his role in events like the Bengal famine of 1943, his attitudes toward Irish independence and Indian self-governance, and the extent to which his writings, including the Second World War, had shaped a version of history that served his own reputation at the expense of accuracy and nuance. The study at Chartwell, frozen in its 1930s arrangement, became, in this context, a more complicated space. It was still the room where Churchill had written books that millions had read and where he had dictated speeches that had stirred nations. But it was also, increasingly, understood as the room where a deeply flawed and often reactionary politician had crafted a narrative designed to obscure his own errors and to position himself as the indispensable man of his age. The quarterdeck floor, once simply a charming architectural detail, could now be read as a symbol of the authority Churchill had claimed, an authority rooted not in democratic consensus, but in his own rhetorical skill and his determination to control how events were remembered. The National Trust, as an institution charged with presenting historic properties to a contemporary public, faced the question of how to interpret Chartwell in light of this evolving scholarship. In 2020, following a broader review of its property's connections to colonialism and historic slavery, the Trust commissioned research into Churchill's record and produced new interpretive materials for Chartwell. The resulting documents, available on the Trust's website and in the House's exhibition spaces, acknowledge Churchill's views on race and empire, note his opposition to Indian independence, and reference the Bengal famine and his contentious record on colonial policy. The materials do not condemn Churchill, such is not the Trust's role, but they complicate him, presenting a figure whose achievements coexisted with beliefs and actions that many now find indefensible. The decision to update Chartwell's interpretation sparked debate. Some visitors and commentators argued that the Trust was imposing contemporary values on a historical figure who should be understood in the context of his own time. Others argued that the new materials did not go far enough, that Churchill's record on empire remained insufficiently acknowledged. The Trust, navigating between these positions, chose a path of disclosure without editorial judgment. The facts were presented, the contradictions noted, and visitors were left to draw their own conclusions. The study, in this new interpretive framework, retained its physical arrangement but gained layers of meaning. Tours of Chartwell still emphasize the room's role in Churchill's literary output, the Nobel Prize, the speeches, the books, but they now also mention the critiques of those books, the ways in which the Second World War shaped a version of history that later scholars have questioned. The quarterdeck floor, visible from the doorway, remains a striking architectural feature, but it is no longer presented simply as the stage of genius. It is also the stage of ambition, self-fashioning, and the selective use of evidence. What makes Chartwell unusual, in the landscape of British historic houses, is that it survives intact. Many of the great country houses that once dotted the English countryside have been demolished, their estates sold, their furnishings scattered. Chartwell, saved by wealth and connections, remains, and its survival means that each generation must decide how to read it. The study, unlike a demolished mansion whose vanished walls cannot be questioned, is still there, still furnished, still framed by the same view Churchill bought. The floor still creaks, the beams still carry the banners, the room demands interpretation, and interpretation changes with the times. Recent visitor feedback collected by the National Trust reveals a range of responses. Some visitors come specifically to see the room where Churchill worked and leave, moved by the physical proximity to a figure they admire. Others come with a more critical perspective, aware of Churchill's record on empire and curious to see how the Trust addresses it. Still others come with little prior knowledge and leave with a more nuanced understanding than they arrived with. The study, in this sense, has become a site of education in the fullest sense, a place where facts, interpretations, and values intersect, and where history is not a settled story, but an ongoing conversation. The quarterdeck floor, now more than a century old, has outlasted the man who walked it. It has outlasted the immediate post-war consensus that treated Churchill as an unambiguous hero. It has survived into a time when his legacy is contested and his writings are read with skepticism as well as admiration. The floor itself is neutral, oak planks carefully laid, but it holds the memory of what was done on it, and memory is never neutral. The study remains unchanged. The questions we bring to it do not. Today, Chartwell draws more than 200,000 visitors each year, and the study on the first floor remains the destination that most of them seek. The house is approached by a curving drive, through woodlands, the red brick facade appearing suddenly above terraced lawns, and visitors enter through the ground floor, where the drawing room and dining room are arranged as they were in Churchill's time. But it is the staircase to the first floor that carries the greatest sense of anticipation. At the top of the stairs, past family bedrooms and guest rooms, a doorway opens onto the study. A rope prevents entry, but the view through the doorway is clear. The desk, the windows, the Weald beyond and underfoot, the quarterdeck planks that Churchill paced for more than 40 years. The room is most often encountered now through photographs. The National Trust's website features high-resolution images of the study taken from multiple angles, and these photographs circulate widely, in books, documentaries, online articles, and social media posts. The images are carefully composed to convey both historical authenticity and aesthetic appeal. Soft light through the windows, the rich colors of the carpet and the book spines, the geometrical precision of the floor planks. The photographs present the room as a finished thing, complete and permanent, a space that has been successfully preserved and that now exists primarily as an object of contemplation. But to stand in front of the study in person is to experience something that photographs cannot convey. The sense that the room is waiting. The desk, though covered with period objects, is empty of work. The lectern stands unused. The floor, polished to a shine by conservation staff, bears no footprints. The room looks less like a place where someone has just left and more like a stage set awaiting an actor who will never arrive. The absence is palpable. The study, preserved so carefully, has been emptied of the very thing that gave it meaning, the presence of the man who walked it, dictated in it, and used it to reshape how his own life would be remembered. The view from the windows, the view Churchill said he bought Chartwell for, remains essentially unchanged. The Weald stretches southward, its contours unaltered by a century of history. On a clear day, the visibility extends for miles, ridge after ridge folding into the distance, the landscape carrying the same pastoral quality that attracted Churchill in 1921. But the view is now framed by a room that belongs to the past, and the contrast between the living landscape outside and the frozen interior is one of the study's most striking features. Time has moved forward everywhere except in this room, which remains locked in an arrangement designed to evoke the 1930s, a decade now almost a century old. Churchill's wish, expressed at various points in his later years, was that Chartwell should one day be of interest to the public. He did not, as far as the records show, prescribe how the house should be interpreted. He did not leave detailed instructions about what should be emphasized or what should be left unsaid. He simply assumed that the house, and especially the study, would speak for itself, that visitors would see the room where he had worked and would understand, without needing to be told, the significance of what had happened there. That assumption was, in some respects, correct. The study does speak, and what it says is legible to anyone who enters. This was a place of labor, ambition, and determination. The floor, the desk, the books, the view, All of these elements combine to tell a story about a man who worked prodigiously, who cared deeply about how he would be remembered, and who used architecture and objects to create a setting that reinforced the authority of his words. But the room cannot control how that story is received. It cannot prevent visitors from asking questions about the books written there, about the narratives shaped on its floor, about the omissions and the self-justifications that those narratives contain. The study at Chartwell survives where many great country houses have been demolished, and its survival is itself a form of privilege. The same social connections, the same access to wealth, the same networks of patronage that enabled Churchill to build and furnish and maintain the house also ensured that it would be preserved for future generations. Not every politician's workspace is saved. Not every writer's study becomes a museum. Chartwell's preservation reflects both its historical significance and the fact that Churchill had the resources and the friends to guarantee that significance would be recognized. The quarterdeck floor is a relic, but it is a relic of power as much as of genius. In the photographs, the study is unchanged. The banners hang from the beams. The desk sits beneath the windows. The floor stretches from wall to wall, its planks aligned like the deck of a ship that never sailed. The room is beautiful, carefully lit, perfectly preserved, and it is empty. Here, on this wooden floor above the Kentish Weald, a statesman tried to turn failure into narrative and narrative into immortality. The house endured. The stories he wrote within it continue to be read, revised, and resisted. In the end, Chartwell does not guarantee a verdict. It simply holds the room in which he tried to write one. In the photographs, the study is unchanged. In the minds that leave it, nothing is.